Chapter 1. The Seamstress in Shadow. The final knot pulled tight against the silk. Odette held the dress at arm's length, her eyes tracing the constellation pattern she'd worked by memory. Lyra sweeping across the bodice, Orion's belt 3 stars of silver descending toward the waist, the bear curled protectively near the hem. 3 months of lamplight, 3 months of waiting until her mother retired upstairs, of threading needle after needle in the amber glow while the river mist pressed against the window. The embroidery caught the light and seemed to shimmer, as though the night sky itself had been captured in midnight blue silk. She allowed herself one breath, just one. The satisfaction of completion, of having made something wholly hers, lived in her chest like a small flame. Then the floorboard above her creaked. Odette moved before thought could catch up. She rose, lifted the dress, silk whispering against her calloused fingers, and carried it to the wooden frame in the back corner. The unfinished linen lay draped across it, a dull gray shroud she'd kept there for months, waiting for exactly this moment. She arranged the dress carefully beneath it, smoothing the linen until no hint of blue remained. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She stood motionless, one hand still resting on the linen, listening. Another creak, then silence. Marina's footfall had been unmistakable, the particular rhythm of her mother's evening check, the circuit of rooms to ensure nothing burned, nothing was wasted, nothing escaped notice. Odette had learned years ago to make herself small in these moments, to become invisible not through hiding but through stillness. She did not move. The lamp flickered. Outside, the river muttered against its banks. Minutes passed, perhaps longer. The amber light slowly dimmed as the wick consumed itself, and Odette remained frozen beside the covered dress, her hand still resting on linen that concealed everything she had claimed for herself. When silence stretched long enough, she let her breath release slowly through her nose. She turned back to her work table, gathered the scattered silk scraps, and tucked them into the bin beneath the cutting board. She smoothed the surface until not a thread remained. Then she sat, pulled her hair back into its knot, and reached for the mending pile, a stack of other women's torn hems and frayed cuffs, work that paid, work her mother expected. The lamp burned lower. The mist curled against the glass. Odette's fingers found their rhythm again, stitching closed what others had torn, mending what had been damaged, making whole what had been worn thin. The gray light crept through the small kitchen window like an apology, offering little warmth and less cheer. Marina sat at the worn oak table, ledgers spread before her like a battlefield map, her gray-green eyes moving across columns of numbers with the precision of a woman who had learned too young that every copper mattered. Odette slipped through the doorway, the fresh pumped water heavy in her arms. She set the pitcher on the counter without ceremony and began the morning's work. The bread from yesterday's baking, a wedge of hard cheese, the thin broth that had simmered overnight into something barely distinguishable from hot water. The midsummer commission from the Eastern merchants' wives. Marina's voice cut through the quiet without looking up from her figures. 6 pieces by the spring ball. 6, and they're offering a pittance because they know we need the coin. Odette's hands stilled on the bread knife. She had heard variations of this speech since childhood, the threat of ruin, the necessity of sacrifice, the weight of survival pressing down on any impulse toward beauty or rest. You'll work nights. Marina finally raised her gaze, sharp as flint. The workshop lamps can stay lit until your fingers bleed if that's what it takes. We don't have the luxury of slow hands. The words settled in the room like stone. Odette nodded, her jaw tightening. She had sown through fever, through grief, through the exhaustion that settled into her bones after 12-hour days. Her mother knew this. Her mother had built her into this. Marina's tone shifted, softening into something that might have been tenderness in another woman's voice. You have a gift, Odette. But gifts are tools. They're not indulgences. Every moment you spend on something that doesn't turn profit is a moment we edge closer to the poorhouse. She paused, letting the words settle. You understand that? I understand, Ma. The reply came automatically, shaped by years of practice. Odette's fingers resumed their work, slicing the bread with careful precision. The cheese went onto the chipped plates. The broth was ladled into bowls that had seen decades of use, their glaze worn to bare clay in places. Then show me you do, Marina returned to her ledgers, the conversation closed. The midsummer pieces. No flourishes. Functional. Fast. That's what sells. Odette carried the meal to the table, set a bowl before her mother, and took her own seat across from her. The broth steamed between them. Outside, the river continued its endless conversation with the stones, indifferent to the small tensions of the Hargrove kitchen. She ate in silence, her mother murmuring figures to herself, the ledgers rustling with each turned page. The morning light strengthened incrementally, revealing the kitchen's poverty of ornament, a functional space, nothing more. No tapestries, no painted plates, nothing that did not serve a purpose. When the meal ended, Odette gathered the dishes and carried them to the basin, her hands submerged in the warm water, scrubbing away the evidence of breakfast. Across the room, Marina had already forgotten her daughter existed, lost in the endless arithmetic of survival. The workshop waited beyond the door. 6 pieces, no flourishes, functional, fast. Odette dried her hands and moved toward the sound of her mother's calculations, her expression carefully blank, her heart a closed book. The workshop on Mill Lane hummed with its midday rhythm, the shuffle of fabric, the murmur of transactions, the particular music of a business that had earned its reputation through decades of reliable hands. Spring light sliced through the windows, catching the dust motes that drifted between bolts of cloth and spools of thread arranged on shelves like soldiers at attention. Odette bent over her work table, her needle flashing in and out of the silk binding. The final piece of the midsummer set, the sixth dress in as many weeks, demanded her full attention. Fine stitching, invisible from the outside but essential to the garment structure. Her fingers knew the motion by heart: press, pull, advance, press, pull, advance. 1,000 repetitions had worn the skill into muscle and bone. A merchant's wife waited near the counter, wrapped commission tucked under her arm, exchanging pleasantries with Marina about the weather and the upcoming ball season. The back room door opened with its familiar creak. Marina emerged, ledgers tucked under her arm, her sharp gaze sweeping the workshop as it always did, taking inventory, assessing, calculating. Her eyes passed over her daughter without pausing, then caught on something near the window, the wooden frame where the constellation dress hung beneath its linen shroud. Odette's needle stilled in her hand. She watched her mother cross the room with deliberate steps, her shadow falling across the work table like a closing door. Marina lifted the linen covering and let it fall. The midnight blue silk caught the spring light, and for a moment the constellation seemed to shimmer, the tiny silver and gold threads catching and holding the sun. The dress hung there in silence, a universe of labor and stolen hours and secret ambition. Her mother's expression revealed nothing. She had seen the dress before, of course. Their home held no secrets in the traditional sense, but her silence now carried weight, purpose. Marina turned the garment slowly, examining the embroidery along the bodice, the invisible stitching at the seams, the hem that fell in a perfect line. "This is fine work." Marina's voice carried no warmth, only assessment. "Better than fine, it's exceptional." Odette did not move from her table. Her fingers had gone still against the silk in her lap. The words sat in her throat, a claim, a protest, a demand, but they would not form. The dress was her creation, her late nights, her lamplight learning, her own hands bringing the design to life. But the silk had come from the workshop stores, the thread from the workshop shelves. In her mother's household, nothing was truly hers. Marina walked to the counter and set the dress beside the leather satchel where she kept the household accounts. She addressed the merchant's wife with a businesswoman's smile. "I have a commission for you." "You're attending the spring ball?" "Yes." The merchant's wife nodded, her eyes already drawn to the dress like a moth to flame. "This is available." Marina gestured to the constellation gown, hand-embroidered finest silk. 3 times what we normally ask for a single piece, but the quality justifies it. Odette stood so abruptly, her chair scraped against the floor, a sound like wood crying out. Marina silenced her with a single look. The look that had stopped Tonian screams and teenage tears and every argument Odette had ever tried to make. "Odette, fetch the wrapping paper." The merchant's wife had already moved closer, running her fingers over the embroidery with delight. "The colors. Did you do this entirely by hand? The precision is extraordinary." She did not ask who made it. She did not think to ask. It was a dress. It was beautiful. It was for sale. Odette stood motionless among the thread shelves, watching her work being parceled away. The hollow feeling in her chest spread outward, filling spaces she hadn't known existed. Marina wrapped the dress with practiced efficiency, accepted payment in the form of a banker's note, and tucked it into the household purse. The coin would cover roof repairs, a cushion against lean times. Practical, rational. When the customer left and the workshop settled back into its quiet rhythm, the space where the dress had hung was bare. The linen covering lay crumpled on the floor like a shed skin. Marina spoke without turning. That coin will keep this house standing. You should be proud. Your work will sustain us. Odette returned to her table and picked up her needle. Her hands trembled against the silk, and the thread slipped from the needle's eye 3 times before she managed to thread it again. The knock came at the dying of the afternoon, 3 precise strikes, the kind that expected an answer. Odette's needle paused mid-stitch, and she looked up from the mended sleeve in her lap. The golden light had turned honeyed, slanting through the workshop windows and catching the dust motes that hung suspended in the air like tiny planets caught mid-orbit. Marina emerged from the back room, drawn by the formality of the sound. Her eyes moved over Odette with the usual assessment working, still working, as expected, before settling on the door. Answer it, Marina said. Odette set down her mending and crossed the workshop floor. She had opened countless doors in her life: suppliers, customers, neighbors with alterations and complaints. She expected another commission, another demand, another transaction in the endless cycle of work and survival. She did not expect the man who stood on the threshold. He was tall, taller than any man she had personally known, with the broad shoulders and easy balance of someone accustomed to horses and open ground. His traveling coat was dark wool, well cut but deliberately plain, the kind of garment that suggested wealth without announcing it. His hair was dark cedar brown, slightly wavy, and his eyes were deep espresso brown, warm and attentive as they swept across the workshop with the quick, assessing gaze of someone who measured both value and character at a glance. He carried an unfinished gown draped across his arm. The silk was emerald richly dyed, and even in the dimming light it seemed to hold its own luminescence. The embroidery at the neckline had been begun but abandoned, skilled work but incomplete, the stitching growing uneven as though the original artisan had lacked the technique to see it through. I need this finished, the man said without preamble. His voice was measured, formal, carrying the faint accent of northern nobility. By tomorrow evening, before the spring ball. Marina appeared at Odette's shoulder, her voice sharp with practiced negotiation. The spring ball is tomorrow. That's impossible. We have other commissions. I'm aware of the timeline. The man's tone was not harsh but absolute. I have the resources to compensate for the haste and for displaced work. He set a small leather purse on the counter. The weight of it was unmistakable, significant coin, far more than the morning's sale had brought. Marina's eyes flickered to the purse, then back to the stranger, then to the emerald silk. Odette had risen from her work table without conscious thought, drawn forward by the quality of the fabric and the presence of the man who carried it. She stepped closer, her gaze fixed on the gown. That's a Venetian weave, she said quietly. Expensive. And the embroidery in Swiglandber. She reached out and touched the delicate stitching at the neckline. It was meant to be Lyonnaise technique. Whoever started it didn't have the skill to finish it properly. The man's attention shifted from Marina to Odette, and something in his expression changed, settled, became more attentive. You know textiles. I know needlework. Odette drew her hand back, suddenly aware of how close she had stood to him. I've been doing it since I could hold a needle. This is my daughter, Marina interjected, her voice carrying the protective edge of a woman who saw her daughter as both asset and responsibility. Odette. She's skilled, but a rush commission of that caliber, Odette. The man interrupted gently but firmly. Can you finish it? By tomorrow evening, the question hung in the air. Odette's mind was already moving through the work, the hours required, the complexity of the embroidery, the precision needed to complete what was begun. She calculated the night ahead, the focus demanded, the risk of exhaustion. And beneath that calculation was something else, a fierce, sudden desire to make something of this silk, to prove that her hands were capable of work that mattered. Yes, she said, but I'll need to start immediately. There's no time for consultation. I'll make the choices about the embroidery pattern as I see fit. Something flickered across the man's face, a slight curve at the corner of his mouth, an approximation of a smile. I trust your judgment. Finish it as you would if it were your own. Marina reached for the purse. We'll take the commission. But the man had not yet removed his gaze from Odette. One condition, he said. Odette wears it to the ball tomorrow. I want to see it finished, and I want to see it on the woman who made it. The workshop went absolutely still. Even the dust motes seemed to halt their lazy rotation. Marina's voice sharpened. That's not possible. Odette doesn't attend the ball. She works. She's not, I'm aware, the man said calmly, of what she is. And what she is the only artisan in this town capable of finishing this dress properly. She finishes it, she wears it. Those are my terms. Take them or decline them, but decide now. The light is failing and she'll need every hour I can give her. Marina looked at the purse, at the emerald silk, at her daughter. Avarice and control wore across her face, but ultimately the coin won. She reached for the purse. She'll finish it, Marina agreed, and she'll wear it. The man nodded as though the matter had never been in doubt. He placed the dress carefully in Odette's hands, and his fingers brushed against hers for the briefest moment. It was brief enough that it might have been accident, but something in the contact traveled through her like a shock of cold water, sudden, clarifying, utterly disorienting. "What's your name?" Odette asked, the question escaping before she could consider protocol. It should have come from Marina, should have been mediated by her mother's careful negotiation. But she asked it as though they were alone in the workshop, as though her mother had not just sold her evening to a stranger. "I'm called Aender," the man said. It was a lie in the shape of a nickname, a partial truth that allowed him to move through the world without title. "And you are Odette Malis Hargrove." He knew her full name. Odette felt the shock of being known travel through her again. "How do you ask about the best artisans when I travel?" Evander moved toward the door, then paused. "Your name comes up in conversation, always associated with exceptional work. I wanted to see the evidence for myself. I have. I'm satisfied." He left. The workshop felt smaller in his absence, and the emerald silk in Odette's arms was suddenly the heaviest thing she had ever held. Marina's voice came from behind her, sharp with instruction. "You'll work through the night. I'll prepare food." You cannot fail at this. But for the first time, Odette did not hear the threat in her mother's words. She heard only the emerald silk and a stranger's voice saying, "I trust your judgment." The oil lamps burned low, casting dancing shadows across the emerald silk. Odette's hands moved with a controlled frenzy, the needle flashing in the lamplight as she invented patterns in real time. The silk accepted her work cleanly, the color deepening under the warm glow, and her choices felt instinctive, as though the dress itself was telling her what it wanted to become. She settled on an inverted constellation pattern, gold and silver thread instead of silver alone, more elaborate, covering the shoulders and upper bodice in a design that suggested both celestial maps and the branching geometry of growing things: leaves, vines, a river seen from above. Marina brought bread, cheese, and hot tea. She did not speak much, but she did not leave either. She sat in the corner chair watching her daughter work, her expression unreadable, perhaps satisfaction, perhaps regret, perhaps only the pragmatism of ensuring the work would not be ruined by exhaustion. Around midnight, Odette became aware that she was no longer thinking about consequences or constraints. She was in the state all makers knew, the state where the making itself was the only reality, where the self dissolved into the task and there was only the next stitch, the next choice of color, the next small decision that aggregated into a whole. She worked through the hours of deepest night, when the world outside the workshop seemed to hold its breath. By the time gray light touched the window, the dress was complete. The emerald silk glowed as though lit from within. The embroidery caught the pale morning light and threw it back in fractures of gold and silver. The hem was finished, the seaming precise, and the dress was a work of art. Odette stood, and her body suddenly became aware of its own exhaustion. Her hands shook slightly as she hung the finished dress on the wooden frame where the midnight blue constellation dress once hung. Marina stood as well. She approached and examined it with the eye of someone who had spent a lifetime assessing needlework. "This is extraordinary," she said quietly. "You are extraordinary." Odette did not respond. She looked at the finished dress, at her own hands still marked with tiny pricks from needle wounds, and she felt something crystallize inside her, a certainty that whatever her mother said now could not unmake what she had just done, could not diminish the reality of her own capability. "Rest for a few hours," Marina said. "The ball begins at sunset. You'll need to dress." For the first time since the stranger left the workshop, Odette spoke. "Ma, I want my wages for the midsummer pieces, all of them." Marina turned, her expression hardening. "What?" "You sold my dress," Odette said, her voice steady, "the one I made for myself. Without asking, without acknowledging that it was mine. I want my wages from those commissions so I can buy fabric to replace it." The workshop fell absolutely silent. Marina's voice when she spoke was ice. "You want to speak to me about what is yours and what is mine? You live under my roof. Every needle you've threaded since you were 6 years old has been the price of your survival, Odette. You don't get wages. You get security and gratitude if you're wise." But something had shifted in Odette, something that could not be shifted back. She met her mother's gaze and did not look away. Then I'll take the wages the stranger offered me for finishing this dress. That was my work, and that coin was offered for my labor. Marina's jaw tightened. That coin is for the household. No, Odette said, I'm finished giving you my work without acknowledgement. Either I receive payment for the labor I do or I stop doing it. Choose. It was the first real defiance Odette had ever spoken aloud, and it hung in the air between them like a dare. Marina's face flushed with anger, but she also saw something in her daughter's expression that warned her this was not a negotiation she could win through force. Marina turned away. Rest. You have a ball to attend. She left the workshop, closing the door between the shop and the household with a decisive click. Odette stood alone with the emerald dress, and she realized she was trembling, but not with exhaustion. She was trembling with the first real taste of standing up for herself, and it tasted like courage and like terror in equal measure. The water had been heated on the kitchen fire and carried in a large basin that now sat in the center of the small bedroom. Steam rose in curling threads, carrying the scent of lavender luxury Odette rarely permitted herself. She undressed methodically, folding her work clothes with the same precision she applied to her stitching, and stepped into the water. The heat seeped into muscles that had clenched around exhaustion for so long they had forgotten how to release. She washed methodically, working the thread scraps from her hair, scrubbing the fine dust of silk and wool from her skin. The water darkened with the residue of days spent hunched over needlework. When she finally rose and dried herself, she caught sight of her reflection in the small hand mirror hanging on the wall. She paused. She had not thought about her appearance in months. There had been no time, no occasion, no reason. But now, standing naked and damp in the golden afternoon light, she saw her body as if for the first time. The strength in her shoulders surprised her. Years of holding fabric taut while stitching had carved definition there. Her wrists were small, boned like a bird's, yet capable of guiding needle through silk with absolute precision. Her skin, where the grime had been washed away, was warm and alive, flushed from the heat of the water. She dressed first in her plainest shift and chemise, the fabric soft from countless washings. Then, carefully, she lifted the emerald dress from where it hung and stepped into it. The silk slid over her skin like water, like a whisper. As she pulled it up over her hips and settled it on her shoulders, something shifted inside her. The dress was not merely clothing. It was an affirmation. The weight of the embroidery sat perfectly, distributed across her frame as though she had designed it with her own body in mind, because she had. Every stitch was hers. She turned to the mirror. The woman who looked back was strange and familiar at once. The emerald silk caught the golden light from the window and threw it back in ripples of color. The inverted constellation pattern glittered at the hem, climbed her skirts in spirals of gold and silver thread, and culminated at her bodice in a burst of stars. She turned slowly, watching the dress move with her, watching the way the seaming followed the contours of her body as though it had always been there, as though it was a second skin she had always possessed but never known. This was not a transformation into someone else. This was a revelation of who she already was. She braided her cinnamon brown hair, weaving it into a practical knot but leaving several strands loose around her face. She did not try to hide the small scars at her fingertips or the pale line on her knuckle where a needle had slipped years ago. They were evidence, proof of the hours she had poured into her craft. A knock sounded at the bedroom door, more a formality than a request. Marina entered without waiting for invitation. She wore her best dark dress, the one she saved for high occasions, and her expression was guarded, unreadable. She looked at Odette for a long moment. Her gaze traveled from the glitter of the embroidery to the fall of the skirt to the bare skin of Odette's throat. You look, Marina said slowly, her voice carefully controlled, like someone who has forgotten her station. Odette met her mother's gaze. The words should have stung, they were meant to, but something had crystallized in her chest, something hard and clear that would not be moved by old accusations. No, Ma, she said quietly. I look like someone who has remembered her own worth. Marina's jaw tightened, her hands flexed at her sides as though she wanted to reach out and smooth something, perhaps the fabric, perhaps the defiance. But she did neither. She simply turned and left the room, her dark skirts whispering against the floorboards. Odette heard her moving through the household, preparing for the evening. The sounds were familiar, the clatter of the kitchen, the opening and closing of drawers, but they seemed distant now, part of a life she was about to step out of. She faced herself in the mirror one final time. The emerald dress gleamed. The evidence of her own hands glittered in the fabric, in every careful stitch, in the perfect fall of the skirt. She felt ready. Chapter 2. The unveiling. The hills steepened as they climbed, and Odette felt the chill evening air against her cheeks. Under her wool cloak, the emerald silk whispered against her legs with each step. Marina walked ahead, her back rigid, her silence heavier than any words. At the top of the rise, the grand assembly hall rose before them like something from a fever dream. Pale stone caught the last light of the setting sun, and torches burned in brackets along the colonnade, casting dancing shadows across the flagstones. Through the tall windows, Odette could see the river winding through the valley below, glinting like a ribbon of dark gold. Inside, the space swallowed her. The ceiling vaulted upward in ribs of carved stone, and hundreds of candles burned in chandeliers that hung like frozen explosions of light. Long tables lined the walls, laden with pewter plates heaped with food, roasted meats, breads, fruits glistening with glaze. A quartet of musicians tuned their instruments in the corner, the skittering notes joining the murmur of hundreds of conversations. Odette's breath caught. She had never seen so many people dressed in such finery. Merchants' wives sparkled with jewelry. Minor nobles wore their family colors like banners. Near the dais, a young woman in deep red sat with the composed posture of someone accustomed to being watched. Marina had already begun edging toward the far wall, toward the cluster of other commoners and craftspeople gathered there like supplicants at the edge of a kingdom. Her message was clear: attend, but do not belong. Odette lingered. Her eyes swept the room, searching for Ander the stranger with the kind eyes and the impossible commission. She found instead a face she recognized. Eleanor Price stood in the center of a loose circle of young women, her head thrown back in laughter at something a minor noble had whispered. She wore a midnight blue dress, and the constellation pattern embroidered along its bodice caught the candlelight like scattered stars. The stolen dress, the one Marina had sold that morning. Something cold moved through Odette's chest. She had known the dress was gone. She had watched the transaction, had felt the loss like a wound, but seeing it worn so casually, so confidently by someone who had no idea what those stitches represented. Odette, Marina's voice cut through the haze. Come away from the main floor. But Odette could not move. She watched as Eleanor lifted one hand to touch the embroidery on her shoulder, the gesture ownership itself. You're looking at something that troubles you. The voice came from behind her. She turned. Evander Lockwood stood there, dressed now in formal gray wool tailored to perfection, with silver regalia at his collar that caught the light. He had not announced himself. He simply appeared, and his gaze moved from her face to Eleanor's dress, and something shifted in his expression. That dress, Odette said barely above a whisper. I made that. My mother sold it without asking. She did not finish. She did not need to. Come with me. He held out his hand. Remove your cloak first. I want them to see what you've finished. Daughter. Marina materialized at Odette's side, her voice sharp as a blade. This isn't suitable. You should remain with Odette. Aspiring had shifted. There was a stillness to him now, a quality that made Marina's protest die in her throat. He was no longer a traveling craftsman, he was something else entirely. Odette, he said, and the weight of her full name spoken with such intention made her step forward. Remove your cloak. Her fingers found the clasp. The wool fell away. The emerald dress bloomed into visibility like a flower opening at dawn. The silk caught the candlelight and threw it back in ripples of deep green and gold. The inverted constellation pattern at the hem glittered as she moved, and every eye in the hall turned toward her. A ripple of silence spread outward from where she stood. Evander extended his hand. Dance with me. It was not a request. Odette placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and steady, and he led her to the center of the cleared floor. The musician, sensing the room's attention, struck up a waltz. His hand found her waist. The moment he touched her, the world changed. Colors deepened. The green of her dress became almost unbearably beautiful, each thread distinct and luminous. The candlelight gained a halo, the music clarified into separate instruments: violin, cello, the faint shimmer of a lute, each note distinct and perfect. She looked up at him, her breath catching. What is this? Later, his voice was soft, meant only for her. First, we dance, and first, everyone watches. They moved through the waltz, and Odette felt the weight of every gaze in the room. Whispers followed them. She saw Marina's face pale and shocked at the edge of the crowd. When the music ended, Evander did not release her hand. He guided her instead toward the dais, toward the seat reserved for the highest-ranking guest, and he placed her there. The message was clear: this woman, this seamstress, was not invisible anymore. Odette rose from the dais. Her legs felt uncertain beneath her as though the ground itself had shifted. Evander kept hold of her hand, his grip deliberate and warm, and he guided her through the thinning crowd. People parted for them, not with reverence, but with the nervous energy of those who had just witnessed something they did not understand. They passed through a side archway and into a narrow corridor lit by sconces of beeswax. The noise of the hall faded behind them, replaced by the soft echo of their footsteps on stone. Odette realized she was still wearing the emerald dress, still glittering with the inverted constellation she had stitched through the night. Evander stopped at a window seat carved into the thick wall. Moonlight spilled through the glass, painting the stone floor in silver. He released her hand, but only to gesture for her to sit. She did. The silk of her dress caught the moonlight and held it. "You've gone quiet," he said, settling beside her but leaving a careful distance between them. "After everything, I expected—" "What?" "What?" She looked at him. His face in the half-light was harder to read, the warmth in his espresso brown eyes still present but guarded now. "That I'd be grateful." "No." He paused. "I expected you'd be afraid." The word landed somewhere true. She was afraid. Not of him, not anymore, but of the magnitude of what had just transpired. The Alpha King had claimed her. The Guildmaster had endorsed her. Her mother had walked away. "I don't know what I'm supposed to feel," she admitted. "You don't have to feel anything yet." He turned slightly toward her, his knee almost touching hers. "But I need you to understand something before the night ends." She waited. "I came to Bridewell to escape my own court," he said, his voice low and steady. "The politics, the expectations, the endless performance of being what everyone needs me to." The doors opened onto cool night air. Odette stepped onto the balcony and the river unfolded before her, a ribbon of silver stretching through the dark valley, reflecting the stars. The noise of the ball fell away behind them, replaced by the soft murmur of water over stone. Evander moved to the railing, and she followed. Her legs ached. Her hands trembled with exhaustion. The work, the confrontation, her mother's departure, the weight of everything that had transpired since sunset. "That dress," Evander said quietly, his gaze on the water, "was made by a woman who loves her work and honors her craft. I knew that the moment I touched the fabric." He turned to look at her, "But I did not expect to find that woman. I did not expect to find that she fits against my own life in a way I've not felt before." Odette met his eyes. "What does that mean? The way the world becomes more vivid when you're near me. What is that?" Evander took a breath. She watched him decide whether to tell her the truth. "In the Northern Reach we have stories," he said, his voice low and steady. "Old stories, perhaps older than the kingdom. They speak of bonds between people that are more than emotional, more than circumstantial. They're rare, they're profound. They bind two people so completely that their perceptions are linked. Their fates become intertwined." "Magic," she said, "yes." He did not flinch from the word. "Not magic you control or cause, but magic that is real and present and transforming. It happens between two people who are meant to be together in a way that goes beyond desire or choice. It simply is." Odette moved to the railing and looked out over the river. She thought of his hand in hers, the way the world had blazed with color and light. She thought of the moment she had decided to defy her mother, to step into the public eye, to be seen. "Why would it choose me?" she asked. "Why now? I'm nobody. I'm a seamstress from a river town. You're a woman who knows how to claim what matters to her." Evander stepped closer. "You worked by lamplight, creating something beautiful because it mattered to you. Then you were tested, and you didn't break. You stood up to your mother. You met my eyes. You took my hand." His voice softened. "You're not nobody, Odette. You're just now being seen." She turned back to face him. In the moonlight, she could see the line of his jaw, the warmth in his eyes, the way he looked at her, as though she were precious and breakable and worth protecting. "What happens now?" she asked. "I don't know how to be what you're offering me. I don't know the rules." "There are no rules." He stepped closer still, and he took her face gently between his hands. "Only choices. I'm offering you a choice: to come to the Northern Keep, to lead the Royal Textile Workshop, to be recognized as a master artisan. And I'm offering you this one." He kissed her. The moment his mouth touched hers, the bond blazed into existence. It was like a door opening, like light flooding into a darkened room, like every cell in her body recognizing a frequency it had been waiting for. She tasted salt and honey and river air. She understood in that moment that her life had fundamentally changed. There was the before, the workshop on Mill Lane, the lamplight, the secret dress, the weight of her mother's control. And there was the after, this balcony,
This man, this kiss, this bond that burned through her like a promise and a revelation and a homecoming all at once. When they parted, she was trembling. Yes, she said, though he had not asked a question. Yes, to all of it, I choose this. Evander pulled her close, and she could feel the rhythm of his heart steady and certain beneath the fine wool of his coat. She could feel the truth of the bond in that heartbeat, real, solid, changing everything. The cart rumbled through the outer gates, and Odette lifted her head to take in the scale of the place. Stone rose on every side, walls that had weathered centuries, towers that caught the last of the afternoon light, a fortress that had been built to last. She had expected coldness.
She had expected to feel small. She did feel small. But it was the smallness of standing at the base of a mountain, aware of height rather than diminished by it. Evander dismounted first, then turned to offer her his hand. She took it and swung down from her saddle, her boots finding cobblestones worn smooth by generations of passage. The sound was different here, solid, certain, nothing like the mud and wood of Mill Lane. The eastern wing, Evander said, falling into step beside her. I thought you'd want to see it before anything else. She understood why the moment they crossed the threshold, the workshop breathed. That was the only word for it, breathed with light and air and possibility. 4 tall windows lined the eastern wall, their glass clean and clear, and through them poured the golden afternoon sun. Looms stood along one side, their frames dark and polished. Shelves held bolts of fabric in colors Odette had only ever seen in her imagination, deep indigos, burning scarlets, silvers that seemed to hold moonlight. She walked forward as though in a dream. Her fingers found a bolt of ivory silk, softer than anything she had ever touched. "This is too much," she whispered. "It's exactly enough." Evander's voice came from behind her. "I asked the master of works what a master artisan would need. He told me."
I ordered it.
She turned to face him. "You didn't have to do this. I did." He held her gaze. "I told you in Bridewell. Your work matters. I meant it. This is what it looks like when a kingdom decides to honor craft instead of merely using it." Odette moved to the window. The moorland stretched beyond the castle walls, vast and wild, the river threading silver through the green. She had spent her entire life in cramped spaces, workrooms without windows, houses where every corner belonged to someone else's needs. Here, she could breathe. "The commissions start arriving tomorrow," Evander continued. "Lady Ashworth has requested a gown for the autumn court. The Duke of Thornmere wants new ceremonial robes. You'll have choices about what you accept and what you decline. This is your workshop, Odette. Your reputation. Your work." She heard the weight in that, heard the responsibility. Her mother had always framed labor as survival, as necessity, as something done because there was no other option. This was different. This was her skill treated as valuable, her vision treated as worthy of space. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. Evander stepped closer. "Work. Create. Show the kingdom what I already know. That you are an extraordinary artisan, and that recognizing talent and skill in all people, regardless of their birth, makes a kingdom stronger. That is thanks enough." He paused, and the corner of his mouth lifted in a half smile. "There is also this. In the evening. The tower that overlooks the moors. I want to show you something." The spiral stairs wound upward in tight loops, and by the time they reached the crown of the tower, Odette's legs burned, and her breath came in shallow bursts. But the moment she stepped through the arched doorway, she forgot every ache. The view stole the air from her lungs. The moorland stretched in every direction, vast, wild, alive with color as the setting sun painted the grasses in shades of gold and deep crimson. To the east, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, their undersides bruised purple, while to the west, the last light caught the river and turned it to flowing amber. Gorse dotted the landscape in dark tufts, and somewhere in the far distance the sea shimmered like a line of molten silver. She had never seen so much space, so much openness. It was nothing like the cramped lanes of Bridewell, nothing like the workshop where she had spent half her life bent over fabric in dim light. "The previous king, my father, used to bring his lovers here," Evander said quietly. His voice was steady, but she caught the weight of old wounds in the words. Not his wife, but the women he chose. He would stand at this window and promise them the world, and then he would return to his duties and leave them in the castle, constrained by propriety and by the expectations of court. Odette turned to look at him. "I swore I would not do that," he he continued. I swore I would not use a woman's affection to secure my own pleasure while offering her a life of constraint in return. He met her eyes. I'm telling you that because I want to be clear about my intentions. The bond between us, it's real and it's binding, but it's also a choice for both of us. She watched him, waiting. I choose you, Odette Hargrove. Not because I need you, not because your beauty serves my purposes, but because you are extraordinary, and I want to build a life with you that honors that. And I want you to choose me in return, not because I'm a king, but because you believe I'm a partner worth having. The wind gusted through the single long window, carrying salt and the scent of gorse. Odette moved to the glass and looked out at the promise of the horizon, the workshop awaiting her, the apprentices who would assist, the commissions already waiting. She thought about the space she now occupied, no longer constrained by her mother's control, no longer invisible, no longer expected to diminish herself to fit expectations. I choose you, she said. She turned back to face him. Not despite your power, but because I've seen how you use it. You used it to recognize my work, to stand beside me against my mother, to build me a space where I can create without compromise. That's not nothing. She held his gaze. But I need you to understand something too. I'm not building a life with you because the bond requires it, or because I'm grateful for the opportunity. I'm building a life with you because I believe in the kind of power you represent, a power that lifts people up instead of pressing them down, a power that recognizes talent and enables it to flourish. I want to be a partner in that vision. I want to help you build a kingdom where artisans are valued, where labor is recognized, where the people who make beautiful things are allowed to claim their own work. Evander smiled. It was a smile of genuine joy, of relief, of recognition that she saw him not as a king, but as a man trying to build something good, and that she wanted to be part of that building. Then we'll build it together, he said. Come, there's something else I want to show you. The master loom dominated the center of the workshop like a monument. Its frame rose nearly to the ceiling, oak darkened by decades of use, its heddles and reeds polished to a soft gleam by the lantern light. The work beam stood empty, waiting. Evander rested his hand on the frame, his fingers tracing the worn wood. This loom has produced some of the finest textiles in the Northern Reach. Royal banners, ceremonial cloaks, the marriage tapestries for 3 generations of my house. He turned to face her. But it has never been used to create something that matters, not truly. It's produced commissioned work, beautiful, yes, but commissioned, required, expected. Odette stepped closer, her hand rising of its own accord to touch the reed. The bamboo was smooth, cool, shaped by generations of weavers. I want you to create something, Evander said. Not a commission from a noble, not work requested by the guild, but something that you make because it matters to you. A textile that represents your vision, your values, your understanding of what beauty and purpose can mean together. The weight of the request settled over her. She had never been asked to make something simply because it mattered. Every stitch she had ever sewn had been for payment, for survival, for someone else's benefit. What should it depict? She asked. Her mind already spun with possibilities, patterns, colors, meanings that could be woven into cloth. Whatever you choose, he said. But I'm going to suggest something. I want you to create a textile that tells the story of a woman who was invisible, who was silenced, who had her work stolen and her voice diminished. And then one day she stood up. She claimed her own creation. She demanded recognition. And she was seen. Not because someone powerful decided to make her visible, but because she was already extraordinary, and the world simply had to adjust to that reality. Tears pricked at her eyes, sudden and hot. She blinked them back, but they came anyway, a single track down her cheek that she did not bother to wipe away. That's my story, she whispered. Yes. His voice was quiet, certain. And it's a story worth telling because there are many women like you in this kingdom, women whose work has been claimed by their mothers, their husbands, their brothers, women whose brilliance has been constrained by circumstance and expectation. If you make this textile, if you display it in the Great Hall, if you claim it as your own vision, then you are not just telling your story, you're telling theirs. She approached the loom. Her fingers found the warp beam, and she could already see the pattern in her mind. threads of midnight blue and emerald green, interwoven with silver and gold, moving from a constricted, tangled center to a brilliant, radiant expansion at the edges. She could see the constellation patterns she had loved since childhood, rendered in a new way, not as secret decoration on a dress made in shadow, but as a public declaration, a bold statement of beauty and agency and self-recognition. "I'll make it," she said. "I don't know how long it will take. It might take months." "Then you'll spend months," Evander said. "That's the privilege of this position, time and resources dedicated to work that matters. When it's finished, we'll hang it in the Great Hall, and every person who enters will know that it was made by your hands, that it came from your vision, that you are the artisan who created it." He stepped beside her at the loom. "But for now, rest. You've had a long journey. Tomorrow you begin. Tonight you rest and you allow yourself to understand that you are home." Odette leaned against him, and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders, and they stood together looking at the empty loom, at the promise of what she would create, at the beginning of a life that for the first time belonged entirely to her. Chapter 3. Authorship and Belonging. The light fell in long golden columns through the tall windows, catching the suspended threads of the master textile until they seemed to glow from within. Odette worked the shuttle through the warp with the practiced rhythm that had become second nature over these 3 months, her fingers moving in precise synchrony with the clack of the reed. The pattern shifted as it climbed, the midnight blue and emerald tangles at the lower edge giving way now to the radiant explosion of silver and gold that she had envisioned from the beginning. Behind her, Margit and Pearl, the two apprentices she had requested from Bridewell, worked at separate frames, their needles flashing as they finished the smaller pieces that would accompany the masterwork. Both young women had arrived with clever hands and hungry eyes, and Odette had taken care to teach them what no one had ever taught her: that their skill was their own, that they deserved credit, that their names should live alongside their creations. Guildmaster Corin Malver stood near the loom's edge, his hands clasped behind his back, his silver-threaded hair catching the light as he tilted his head to examine the textile's progression. He had made the journey from Bridewell 3 days prior, and Odette had grown accustomed to his quiet presence, his measured observations, his way of asking questions that revealed both respect and genuine curiosity. "This is extraordinary," Malver said, moving closer. He reached out as if to touch the textile, then withdrew his hand, remembering the cardinal rule of the loom: never interrupt the weaver's work. The technical skill alone is remarkable, but the conceptual depth? This is not merely decoration. This is meaning made manifest in thread. Odette did not pause in her movements. It's a story about a woman who learned to claim her own creation, about the moment between silence and speech, between invisibility and being seen. Malver was quiet for a moment. In Bridewell, they say the textile will change how the guild evaluates work. They say it will open doors for artisans who have been overlooked. He paused. They are right to say so. The door to the workshop swung open, and a young man in the castle's livery entered, bowing first to Odette and then to Malver. "Mistress Hargrove, His Majesty requests your presence in the Great Hall. There is a matter requiring your expertise." Odette set down her shuttle and wiped her hands on the linen apron she wore while at the loom. The interruption was not unexpected. Evander had told her that visitors had arrived, though he had not specified their purpose. "What matter?" "A guest has arrived," the messenger said. "A noblewoman from the Eastern Territory. She requires a commission, but it's a sensitive matter. His Majesty thought you might wish to be consulted before the terms are agreed upon." Odette exchanged a glance with Malver, who nodded encouragement. She had learned, over these 3 months, that her expertise was valued not merely in the execution of work, but in the conceptual and business decisions that surrounded commissions. She was consulted. Her opinion mattered. She followed the messenger from the workshop toward the Great Hall. The Great Hall of Thorn Hollow smelled of beeswax and old wood, the scent of centuries settling into the stone walls. Afternoon light cut through tall windows and sharp columns, casting the dark silhouettes of ancestral crests across the flagstones. Smaller than the Grand Assembly Hall in Bridewell, but heavier with history, every beam and banner seemed to press down with the weight of decisions made and unmade within these walls. Lady Isolde Marin stood near the center of the hall, her traveling clothes elegant but road-worn, her posture composed despite the nervous way her fingers twisted at her gloves. She turned as Odette entered, accompanied by Evander, and her pale face flushed slightly. "Mistress Hargrove," Lady Isolde said, her voice carrying the careful formality of someone navigating a delicate situation. "I've come to commission a dress. But more than that, I've come to apologize. Odette felt a jolt of surprise. Of all the people she might have expected to visit the Northern Keep, Lady Isolde was not among them. Apologize? Odette asked carefully. 3 months ago, I commissioned a dress from the Hargrove household, an emerald gown. But I changed my mind about the color. I wanted red instead. Lady Isolde paused, her expression becoming more vulnerable. The change meant that the dress I had originally commissioned became available. That dress was sold to Eleanor Price. I only later understood that the dress itself was an original creation, not simply a commission, and that its sale was deeply inappropriate. She took a breath. I also came to understand that this dress was not merely sold, but that it was worn by someone other than the artisan who made it, and publicly displayed as though its maker was not the person who deserved credit. That troubled me. I spoke to His Majesty about the matter, and he suggested that if I wished to make amends, I should come to you directly. Odette realized in this moment that Evander had orchestrated this meeting, not to humiliate Lady Isolde, but to give Odette the opportunity to establish her own terms regarding the original theft and misappropriation of her work. Why did you change your mind about the color? Odette asked. It seemed a small question, but it carried weight, Odette asking to understand Lady Isolde's reasons, her agency in a situation that had ripple effects far beyond what she likely intended. Because I wanted to feel bold, Lady Isolde said quietly. I wanted to wear a color that announced my own choices, that went against the expectations of what a noblewoman from my territory is supposed to prefer. Red is not a safe choice, blue is more decorous, but I wanted to feel alive in what I wore, not merely appropriate. Odette heard her own longing reflected in those words, the desire to claim agency through clothing, to announce oneself through beauty and color rather than hide behind propriety. I'll make you a dress, Odette said, but not the red one you originally wanted. Instead, I'm going to make you something that combines both your instinct, the boldness that led you to choose red, and your recognition that there was a cost to that choice. I'll create a dress that integrates the two impulses, a textile base of deep red but embroidered with patterns of blue constellation, so that even in your boldness you carry the awareness of the interdependency of choices. Lady Isolde's eyes widened slightly. That's quite profound, and also somewhat humbling. You're essentially creating a dress that will remind me of the consequences of my choices. Not to shame you, Odette said, but to acknowledge that power, even the small power of a noblewoman to commission what she wishes, carries responsibility. The color you choose, the dress you decide to wear, affects other people. My mother, for instance, Eleanor Price, me, understanding that interconnection is part of growing up. Evander, watching this exchange, seemed satisfied. He stepped forward slightly. Guildmaster Malver is here to document the commission terms. I believe the three of you should work out the details together. Odette's expertise should guide both the artistic vision and the business terms. He left the three of them to negotiate, and as Odette began to discuss colors and patterns and timeline with Lady Isolde and Guildmaster Malver, she realized that she was not merely executing a commission. She was building a reputation, establishing her authority, teaching others how to value her work and her vision. The kiss deepened, then softened, and when they finally pulled apart, the great hall felt different, warmer, smaller, as though the hundreds of candles burned only for them. What now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Now, Evander said, you decide what comes next. The workshop is yours. The commissions are yours. If you wish to continue creating for the crown, the guild will support you. If you wish to take on students, to travel, to simply rest, you're free to do that too. I didn't bring you here to trap you in another cage, even a gilded one. Odette glanced back at the master textile. The woman in the design had stepped out of shadow and into light, her form no longer fragmented but whole, her hands no longer hidden but raised, open, claiming space. I want to keep working, she said, but I want to do it on my terms, not because I'm desperate, not because someone will take what I've made if I don't fight for it, because I love creating.
Yes. Because I have things still to say through fabric and thread, then say them. He squeezed her hand. The world is finally listening. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the candlelight play across the textile's surface. Somewhere across the hall, Guildmaster Malver was speaking with a group of merchants, his voice carrying the careful enthusiasm of a man who recognized opportunity. Lady Isolde had already left, her new dress wrapped in cloth, but Odette knew they would meet again. Their conversation at the fitting had opened something, a thread of understanding between them. Marina had slipped away sometime during the evening. Odette had noticed her mother's retreat, a quiet exit through a side door, her back straight, her face unreadable. There would be time for that conversation later, or perhaps there wouldn't. Either way, Odette had made peace with the uncertainty. Come, Evander said eventually. The night is still young, and I want to show you something. He led her toward a window on the far side of the hall, where the moorlands stretched out beneath a sky thick with stars. The view from Thorn Hollow was different than the view from her old workshop in Bridewell, wider, wilder, full of possibility. Every time I look at this landscape, Evander said, I think about how much of it remains unseen.
How many stories haven't been told? Odette leaned against the stone frame, feeling the coolness of it against her shoulder. And how many artisans are out there right now, working by lamplight, creating beautiful things no one will ever notice? Too many. His voice was quiet. That's what I'm hoping you'll help me change. She turned to face him, and in his eyes she saw not just love, but a vision, a future where talent wasn't buried beneath fear, where women like her could claim their work without apology. Then let's get to work, she said. The workshop hummed with purposeful activity. 3 looms worked in rhythm, their shuttles passing back and forth like heartbeats. Odette moved through the space with practiced ease, her fingers brushing fabric as she assessed each apprentice's progress. Margaret had become a fine weaver. Pearl, once a nervous girl from Bridewell, now ran the embroidery corner with quiet authority. Young Tomas, the newest, concentrated on his tension work with his tongue slightly protruding, the way Odette remembered doing as a child. The blue's too dark for the third panel, she told Pearl, not unkindly. It'll read as shadow when we want depth. Pearl nodded and swapped the thread. Commissioned works lined the far wall, vestments for a high church official, formal wear for a duke's wedding, tapestries for a merchant house in the southern cities. Each piece bore her mark in silver thread, not hidden but visible, a declaration of authorship that would have been unthinkable in Bridewell. Guildmaster Melver visited that morning, as he often did. He examined the church vestment with the critical eye of a man who had spent decades judging quality. The embroidery tells a story, he observed. The saint's martyrdom, her refusal to be silent. Seraphina spoke the truth to power, Odette said, and they killed her for it. Malver hummed in approval. Conceptual depth, that's what elevates craft to art. He made a note on his ledger and departed, leaving Odette to her work. She was adjusting the tension on the vestment's third panel when Evander arrived. He carried 2 cups of tea, a habit he'd developed over the months, appearing in the afternoon with refreshments, sitting in the corner with papers while she worked. Working late again, he asked, setting 1 cup beside her. There's always more to create. He watched her for a moment, that familiar warmth in his espresso brown eyes. Then he cleared his throat. I've been speaking with representatives from the Eastern Territories, he said. They want to establish a formal textile school, a place where young artisans can study under masters. They're asking if you'd be willing to help develop the curriculum. Odette looked up from her work. That's enormous. It would require time away from the workshop, travel, planning. I know. He held her gaze. You can decline, but I'm asking you to consider it because I think it's the kind of work that matters. It's not just about craft. It's about changing the system that undervalues artisans, that treats them as expendable. A school could shift that. It could create a new generation who understand their own worth from the beginning. She considered this, thinking of her apprentices, of all the young women who had come to her seeking to learn a trade that valued their intelligence. I'll do it, she said. Not right away, but next year, after I've finished the current commissions and the apprentices have progressed further, I'll help build something that will outlast both of us. Evander smiled, and she saw in that smile the man who had arrived at her workshop months ago, with an unfinished dress and an invitation to step into the light. I knew you would. Later that evening, Odette stood alone in her workshop, looking at the master textile she had created in her first months at the Northern Keep. The textile, now framed and hung in a place of honor, told the story of her transformation, from constraint to liberation, from invisibility to recognition, from silence to voice. She touched the silver thread depicting the upper portion of the pattern, the radiant, explosive designs that represented her emergence into the light, and she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she had accomplished, not just in craft, but in reclaiming her own story, her own value, her own right to exist as a person worthy of recognition and love. She was no longer the seamstress of Mill Lane, working by lamplight under her mother's control. She was Odette Malis Hargrove, master artisan of the Northern Reach, teacher, builder, creator of meaning made manifest in thread and color and light. The chapel bells rang as Odette stepped through the arched doorway. She moved slowly, each step deliberate, her gaze fixed on Evander where he waited at the altar. The gown she had created moved with her like something alive midnight blue silk that caught the light from the stained glass windows and transformed it into constellations of silver and gold. The embroidery traced the patterns she had first stitched in secret, the ones that had started everything, the dress her mother had sold, the dress Evander had given her, now woven together into a single thread of meaning. Evander's breath caught. He had seen her in emerald, in candlelight, in the quiet hours of the morning when she bent over her work. But this was something else. This was a declaration made manifest in fabric and thread, a synthesis of every moment that had brought them here. Odette reached the altar and the chapel fell silent save for the shuffle of witnesses settling into their seats. She saw Guildmaster Malver nodding slightly from the front row, his expression one of quiet pride. She saw Margaret and Pearl sitting together, their faces bright with excitement. And in the back, slightly apart from the others, she caught a glimpse of Marina, her mother, here in Thorn Hollow, watching her daughter marry the Alpha King. The officiant began the ceremony, but Odette barely heard the words. She was conscious of Evander's gaze, of the way he looked at her not as a sovereign looking at a subject, not as a man looking at a prize, but as a partner looking at the person he had chosen. Odette, the officiant said, speak your vows. She took a breath. I promise to stand beside you, not behind you or beneath you, but beside you as your partner, your maker, your mirror. I promise to speak the truth, even when it is difficult, even when silence would be easier. I promise to build with you, to create structures that allow others to flourish, to never stop making, never stop growing. Evander's fingers tightened around hers. Evander, the officiant said, speak your vows. I promise to see you, he said, his voice low but clear in the silent chapel. Not just your work, not just your brilliance, but you, yourself, your soul, your complexity. I promise to never dim your light, to never silence your voice, to never treat your gift as something lesser than my crown. I promise to build a kingdom where you are never invisible again. The officiant blessed the union and they exchanged rings, simple bands of silver, unadorned, bearing her mark in tiny constellation patterns. As the rings slipped into place, Odette felt something shift in her chest, a settling, a rightness that needed no words. The chapel bells rang again as they stepped back from the altar, and the witnesses rose in celebration. But Odette heard only Evander's voice, only his promise, only the quiet certainty of his hand in hers. They walked together through the castle corridor toward the great hall, where the feast waited. Odette felt the weight of the gown, the brush of the embroidery against her skin, the solid reality of the ring on her finger. She thought of Bridewell, of the workshop on Mill Lane, of all the years of silence and smallness. She thought of her mother, still standing apart in the chapel, carrying her own unspoken words. But those thoughts felt distant now, part of a story that was still being written, not ended, not resolved, but continued. She was no longer thinking in terms of before and after. She was thinking in terms of now, of this moment, of the future still unfolding. The great hall opened before them, filled with light and laughter and the promise of celebration. The Northern Keep's textile school hummed with purpose. Odette stood before a semicircle of students, some barely past childhood, others gray-haired and seasoned in their craft. All of them leaned forward, pencils poised over notebooks, eyes fixed on her as she traced the lineage of unnamed artisans. The woman who makes the dress is not less important than the woman who wears it, she said. But for centuries, the maker has been erased, her labor treated as supplementary or anonymous. We are here to change that. Each of you will be recognized for your work. Each of you will be credited as the author of what you create. That is not a privilege, it is a right. A young woman in the front row wrote furiously. An older man near the back nodded slowly, his hands calloused from decades at a loom. The lesson continued, techniques, histories, the politics of craft. When class dismissed, Odette gathered her notes and made her way through the renovated wing, past the clatter of looms and the murmur of students collaborating on designs. A letter had arrived that morning. She carried it still, folded in her pocket. A noblewoman from the Western Territories wanted Odette to train one of her craftspeople, not to commission from Thorn Hollow, but to build capacity in her own territory. The request was the first fruit of something Odette had been cultivating for months, a redistribution of knowledge, a crack in the old systems where skill flowed only upward toward power. She turned a corner and nearly collided with a cluster of men in formal coats, representatives from two neighboring territories deep in conversation with Evander. He stood apart, his bearing relaxed but commanding, listening to one of the men speak. He caught sight of Odette and paused. His gaze found hers. He smiled. Not the public smile he wore for court, but something smaller, private. His hand lifted in a small gesture, fingers spread, then curled toward his chest. I see you. I'm thinking of you. I'm proud of you. She answered with a nod, her own hand resting briefly on her heart. Then she continued down the corridor, leaving him to his politics. Her workshop awaited, a space that had become hers in ways she was still adjusting to. The commission lay on the work table, a textile for a royal diplomatic gift, a representation of the Northern Reach's commitment to honor, to recognizing the skill and talent of all its people. It would be seen by important people, it would carry meaning far beyond its immediate context. She sat at the loom. Her hands found the thread. The pattern emerged stitch by stitch, silver and gold on midnight blue, constellations she had designed herself, work that bore her name. She fell into the rhythm of creation, where nothing existed but the next choice, the next color, the next moment of bringing something beautiful into being. She thought of Bridewell, the workshop on Mill Lane, the young seamstress working by lamplight, creating in secret, unable to claim her own work. That woman felt both very far away and very present. She was the foundation on which this woman had been built, this recognized master artisan, this teacher, this partner in building a different kind of kingdom. The work continued. The pattern grew. Odette Hargrove was home.